Welcome to another episode of Stir Crazy on the Real News Network. This is the show we made so we wouldn't go crazy. With our hosts Kim Brown, Tunde Ogunfolaju, Steve Horn, and myself, Charles Lenchner. This is the Real News Network's latest show, and we love your feedback. Let us know you're here and what's on your mind today. Are we helping you survive another day in isolation? And for our first story, some good news. We're using a story that we got from our friends at The Independent, the free print newspaper in New York City that's been going on for decades now. And they wrote about the rise of these mutual aid networks that are springing up organically in all kinds of places. Tunde, you want to tell us what's going on there?
Sure, absolutely. First, I'd like to say what up to everybody out there. How's it going? How's quarantine life for you? But really, this article by Independent, by Peter Ruh, I believe his name is pronounced. He talks about how roughly a third of New York City's coronavirus cases are in Queens. And that the Queens is basically the hardest hit by the virus, and there are these groups, neighborhood-based groups that are essentially banding together and providing some of the nets, social nets that essentially the government and other agencies aren't actually supplying to the people. So there's he lists a couple different instances of this. So for instance, you have a person like Cheryl Rivera, who's a data analyst for the New York City Department of Education, and she moonlights as like a Democratic Socialist of America's, or she's in that group for the Democratic Socialist of America's feminist working group. And she set up an online fund for New Yorkers who are struggling to buy groceries. And the message, quickly spread about what she was doing. And within the first 5 days that they had it up, they raised about $28,000 for this. And even as far back as March 21st, they had collected about $40,000. So that's the gist of this article here, is just basically talking about how people and groups are banding together to essentially take care of each other. I think Lauren Hitt, who's AOC spokesperson, kind of said it best. She said mutual aid is not so much a form of charity as it is about creating a support network where everybody's needs are met. And that's exactly right. It's essentially just taking care of your neighbor and making sure that the person who's next to you is okay, is good, doesn't have anything that they have to need for, such as like food or medicine, things like that. And the article goes on to talk about how the specific ways people are actually banding together. Like there are people or groups who are doing things like running errands for the elderly, helping people who buying groceries and medicine, or even something as not necessarily thought of as critical, but still might be as critical as FaceTiming with people who might be feeling lonesome or feeling the effects of this whole social distancing thing. And then all of this is done as well in coordination, I believe, with DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, where they're coordinating some of these things. And so long story short, that's the gist of the article. And it's a bit of good news in an otherwise sort of dismal feeling situation. There are people and situations out there that just make you question whether we can make this experiment called America really work at the end of the day. But then you see things like this where people are doing things out of the kindness of their own hearts and really working hard to make sure that everybody is taken care of during this chaotic time.
Well, it's interesting to note that this is happening in New York City, especially in the outer boroughs that are not Manhattan. New York City was witness to the rise of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And one of the main features of that was the speed at which its activists used the internet networks, used social media in order to expand what they were doing and reach more people, eventually blossoming to hundreds of occupations around the world. But after Occupy Wall Street's encampment was down and Superstorm Hurricane Sandy came to town, you saw those same networks being advocated for disaster and emergency relief along the coastlines, the worst hit areas like the Rockaways in Queens. And I think that what's happening now is that some of the very same people who cut their teeth in activism during Occupy Sandy, who started using phrases like mutual aid back then, now they belong to different groups, they live in different neighborhoods, but they know how to come together in this moment and resurrect those networks that are trying to advance an alternative to whatever the neoliberal, normal, state-run, top-down response would be from the authorities. And they're presenting it as a political alternative. Tunde, I want to ask you, and Kim, feel free to jump in, do you think that this kind of activity will yield political dividends?
I'd be lying if I said I wasn't terribly optimistic. I think there are a lot of articles and there are a lot of people making commentary, that people are going to be forced to see, that, the way that we've been doing things has been sorely incorrect, and that, some of the social nets that we've had aren't enough, that we need more, and we need to go a whole hell of a lot further than we have. I'm extremely skeptical that that's going to be the case, because I remember thinking, looking back at after the 2016 election, I thought that there would be this sort of this emphasis on understanding exactly what went wrong and analyzing it. And that didn't happen. We're right back to the same conversations that we were having before then. I think the needles moved a little bit, but not enough for true change. And then, another sort of indicator that that's not going to be the case is, look, we just walked out of a recession back in 2007, 2008, right? That was what, 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And it does not appear that we've learned really any of the lessons that we were taught from back then. So I'm really skeptical that we're going to walk out of this with any sort of true change in comparison to really sort of having some sort of political sway based on these circumstances.
So Dave, I wanted to hop in here and say real quick that a lot of these mutual aid organizations and these new movements, or as Charles, as you mentioned, movements that began during an earlier political time and that have, morphed into what we need here in 2020. A lot of these groups are trying to serve the most marginalized. And that is the disabled, people who are elderly, people who are not mobile, people who may be gender nonconforming or trans, who may not be able to obtain state aid with identifications that don't have their name on it, but have like their dead name on it. So it is so crucial and really just a godsend for so many of these people who are falling through the cracks of, say, applying for unemployment. Like if you're a college student and you work part-time, you don't qualify for the stimulus package. That doesn't mean you don't need to eat. That certainly doesn't mean you don't require housing. And for a lot of these groups to fill that void, it's unfortunate. I hate to say it like this, guys, and let me know if you agree or disagree. It's kind of libertarian. You know what I mean? Like, the libertarians believe in, small government, but they believe in the philanthropic nature of, people to step in and help their fellow man, despite the fact that we pay taxes and the government shouldn't be doing a lot of this shit anyway. Go ahead, Charles.
This reminds me of a story that came out, maybe 6 months ago, of some anarchists in Portland who were filling potholes by themselves. And it was being celebrated as this great example of, those those interesting anarchists showing up, the local government in Portland, and a lot of other people were scratching their heads being like, so what's the message here? We don't need as much government?
No, I mean, we need to be getting our money's worth. It shows the ineptitude of government, that people have to take some things upon themselves to fill the void that government doesn't do, federal, state, local, or otherwise. Because if we had, say, for example, a better healthcare system, a nationalized healthcare system, then people would be, their needs would be better cataloged, I guess. You know what I mean? Like, we wouldn't wonder whether or not someone is able to, we wouldn't have a lot of the stuff, a lot of the ills, I guess we should say, that bother America specifically. But yep, that's all I got.
Thank you, Kim. And just a note for those tuning in, we heard just now from Kim Brown, a Leo and notable curmudgeon that we're happy to have on staff. And before that, you all heard Tunde Ogunfolaju, who is also the host of the Fade podcast. And now we're turning to our next story, still staying in New York, and this is about Rikers Island. For those of you who don't know, there has been an ongoing multi-year struggle to shut down Rikers, and that struggle, in a sense, has won. There's still some arguing over what the city is going to do with its, I'm putting air quotes here, need for jail space, but it is a settled issue that Rikers is going to be shut down at some point. But while that hasn't happened yet, there are a lot of people there. Dwayne, can we start the clip from the Real News story about what's happening there?
Right. I got a phone call from a friend of mine who's been incarcerated in Rikers for the past few months. And I've been trying to get in touch with him for the past few days because I got word over the weekend that 2 dorms worth of people, about 48 people, in the Robert and Daverin Center were basically going on a small-scale strike. They were refusing to leave to go to their work details, and they're refusing to go to the mess hall in protest of the conditions within that island, which are deteriorating just rapidly. They're already bad, but now they're getting so much worse. The people who are imprisoned on this island, they barely have basic supplies. They had to go on this strike in order to get masks, to get some cleaning supplies. There's still no hand sanitizer. There's no bleach. People are sick. There are people, I think there are about 39 reported cases now on the island, and there are also about 82 people who are being held in quarantine in the West Facilities Infectious Diseases Center. They're overflowing.
So give us an update, Steve. The journalist here, who, by the way, is the labor reporter for Teen Vogue, and we just celebrate for a second that there is a publication called Teen Vogue that has its own labor reporter. What are the new stats?
Yeah, well, the New York Times has just reported a couple hours ago that there are now 167 prisoners at Rikers Island who have coronavirus cases, and 137 staff members. So it's a huge amount, over 300 people total, and over half of those are the actual prisoners, and then like a little bit less than half are the staff that are interfacing with literally all of them throughout the day. I'm not sure how many of those staff members will be put under quarantine themselves, or like how they're going to deal with the situation if the whole staff or a lot of the staff is being infected with coronavirus. So, I mean, this points to just this broad system-wide issue that we have in a United States prison system, that they're petri dishes, if you will, of coronavirus spread. They're contained. People are tightly packed. Prisons are overcrowded in the United States. And we're seeing the exact same trend, not only in Rikers Island, but in America's most crowded jail, which is Cook County Jail in Chicago. So there, the latest numbers that I saw, there's 89 cases, but growing. And so Cook County has 5,000 people in their jail. 4,000 of them are classified as violent offenders. And I think that the biggest push right now that's happening is to get nonviolent offenders out of jails. But I think that this also points to the Chicago situation, not to go away from Rikers, but I just want to say, because it points to this broader trend in America. In Chicago, what they're doing is creating quote unquote quarantine camps, in which you are, if you get the coronavirus, you are put into a quarantine camp. And in Chicago, what they're doing is actually using former mental health facilities to do that. And I think it points to the huge, a huge part of what's the whole issue of our prison, why are prisons so overpopulated to begin with. We have a mental health crisis in America, and we have deinstitutionalized mental health facilities. So in Chicago, when Rahm Emanuel was the mayor, there were 12 facilities open when he started as mayor. And Rahm Emanuel, of course, Obama's former chief of staff, his first chief of staff, he closed half of them. So it went from 12 to 6. And now those facilities, kind of ironically enough, people who are getting coronavirus in these overcrowded jail system in Chicago, they're being put in the mental health facility. So I just wanted to point that out because I think it just symbolizes just the atrocity of the American prison system so clearly.
Well, this highlights, this virus, this pandemic is highlighting so many of the obvious things about the system that we live in the United States. This form of neoliberal capitalism in which the weak are given as little as possible, and among the weakest, you're going to find prison populations. And on that note, I just want to give the mic over to Kim to talk about how, in the discussion of how prisons and jails are going to address the coronavirus and inmates that are catching it, there's a lot of talk about releasing people, especially nonviolent offenders. But as might be expected, this is probably going to be carried out in the most racist way possible. Kim?
Well, at least on the federal side, more than likely, as you said, Charles, it will be carried out in the most racist way possible across the board. But let's talk about the feds here for a second. So last Thursday, U.S. Attorney General Bill Barr issued a memorandum effectively setting free low-level offenders who also happen to be either elderly or sick. He authorized their release to home confinement, right? Well, the problem is in federal prisons, the standard that Attorney General Barr is using is going to overwhelmingly leave Black inmates still incarcerated. So as part of Donald Trump's alleged prison reform efforts, as part of his First Step Act, there's something called pattern, right? And it's an algorithm which figures out which offenders are more at risk for recidivism and which ones are low risk. Well, surprise, surprise, white collar crimes are figured in more so into the low risk portion of the algorithm, whereas people who have drug offenses and possibly other related yet nonviolent offenses, such as larceny or theft or burglary or forgery, those offenses, even though they are nonviolent, still factor into that particular prisoner's pattern score. So according to the DOJ's own data, using the same standard, it would keep overwhelmingly over 90% of the Black inmates still incarcerated while freeing a large majority of white offenders. So yeah, it wouldn't be American jails if there wasn't a racist component to it. And of course, when we factor in stuff like algorithms, science, math, and everything, well, the people who are programming the algorithms have their own racial biases as well. So we can't say that the math is void of racism itself. So there is no rush to let out prisoners, unfortunately. And a lot of people's lives are going to be lost, but not only those who are incarcerated. I mean, I believe on Rikers Island, over 60 correctional officers have tested positive for COVID-19. So while we know that to the prison system that Black lives don't matter, they're kind of showing us that blue lives don't matter either.
Well, if you know anything about the folks working in the New York system, of course, majority of the officers there in the corrections department are people of color, especially Black men and women. But I wanted to sort of throw you a softball. Help us understand why it is that supposedly objective criteria that are aimed at releasing nonviolent prisoners, how is it that a measure that can be spoken about as if it's race neutral actually has an impact that is clearly racist?
I mean, pick something, Charles. I mean, we had the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, right? The 15th Amendment guarantees everybody the right to vote, regardless of race, creed, color, whatever. It doesn't matter because shortly thereafter the passage of the 15th Amendment, Jim Crow laws took effect into the American South, and the people, African Americans, who were just given the legal constitutional right to vote, immediately had those rights taken away, stripped away. So what we're seeing right now is basically a continuation of that. Like any opportunity to screw over Black people, America never misses an opportunity. That's like one of our favorite sports. If there's a chance to screw over Black folks, the U.S. government is going to do it every time and do it better than the last time they did before.
And I'll add one more thing to that, which is that one of the other reasons for the discrepancy is that if you over-police a particular community for decades, once you've committed that governance sin, it's going to cascade through the system. So that over-policing is one of the root causes for why there would be so many African-American men locked up for crimes in general, whether they're deemed violent or nonviolent.
Over-policing since 1865. Okay.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So we're going to stop right now for just a little bit of a pitch here. We want to make sure that folks know that the Real News Network is here for you during this pandemic, but also before and also after. We rely on you for support. And Dwayne.
Hi everyone, my name is Genevieve Montanar and I'm a producer here at the Real News Network. This is our spring fundraising drive and we are trying to raise $50,000 and we need your help. March is Women's History Month, and here at the Real News, women power our organization in front of and behind the camera. If you like the work that we are doing, please go to our website and hit the donate button now. Thank you for your support.
Great. Thank you for that. And now we're actually headed to our next story. We're turning a little bit to a labor focus now. There is so much labor organizing going on. And one of the first stories that we have is about the organizing taking place at Whole Foods. Tunde, you want to give us an update on the Whole Foods situation?
Last view, I counted 10,000 green.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, Whole Foods employees are planning to strike on Tuesday, which is March 31st. And so they're planning to all collectively call in sick. And they're doing so because they've, essentially been facing some pretty terrible situations. What they're advocating for and what they're trying to essentially get is essentially they want paid leave for all workers who stay home or self-quarantine during the crisis, free coronavirus testing for all employees, and hazard pay of double the current hourly wage for employees who show up to work during the pandemic. So what Whole Foods did previously to this was essentially give them a $2 bump in pay, which, from essentially what they were getting paid, what some of the employees were getting paid is pretty minuscule considering the risk that they're taking. And so yeah, that's essentially where we stand with it. And this is kind of a crazy scenario because you have a situation where, essentially those who work in, the grocery store industry, and they're essentially considered essential. So, but what if that essential work that we all need to go to the grocery store and get food and all the other things that we need. What if they're all collectively not there? But also, what if the needs that they have aren't being met? There were so many different stories about the Whole Foods essentially not caring for these workers, not providing them with even the basic equipment to sort of guard against the coronavirus. And as I was kind of reading this article, I thought several things, and one of the things that I that I kind of couldn't move off of was, as Whole Foods, wouldn't you want to go out of your way to make sure you're taking care of those employees who are actually showing up to work? That there are people who are getting sick, who are calling out sick, who are legitimately sick, and I think there was a story from a woman who she essentially got sick, but they didn't test her, or that she couldn't get tested for coronavirus, and so because of this, they said, "Oh, well, you can't. We're not going to allow you to call out because it's not confirmed that it's actually coronavirus." But she couldn't, get testing for it. So it really is this crazy scenario. And I can't for the life of me figure out why, as Whole Foods, especially since given the fact that you're making massive profits off the fact that everybody's just buying everything that's on your shelves pretty much every single day, why you wouldn't even find it necessary to just give them something such as like double their pay for showing up to work. It really does boggle the mind, and you'd have to think that essentially they're coveting profits over really caring for the people that they have out there on the front lines. Yeah.
Right. Another reason might be that the owner of Whole Foods, the former owner of Whole Foods before they were sold to Amazon, is a well-known anti-union libertarian who, prided himself on making sure that a union never had a foothold in Whole Foods. So it's interesting to see that now that Amazon owns Whole Foods, that we're starting to see an uptick in worker organizing there.
Yeah. In situations like this, it's and a lot of the comments that were made in both the Hill's article as well as Vice's article for this, a lot of people spoke without giving their names because they were afraid of retaliatory retaliatory response from Whole Foods. And that's a shame, right? That people can't just speak the truth about what's going on because they're afraid that they're just going to be singled out and fired or their hours cut back or whatever the case is. And that induces this sort of culture of silence, that it's okay to not say anything because nobody wants to speak out in fear of losing their job, in fear of losing that even that little bit of amount that they're getting from Whole Foods. So it's a shame that certain companies don't go out of their way to take care of their workers, especially during a time like this when we're facing something that's unprecedented in our sort of modern history. And you would think that they would go out of their way to ensure that the people that they have who are facing that problem directly are really well taken care of, and put to the forefront of the people who stand to benefit at least a little bit from this. So if they're going to risk going out and working under these circumstances, at the very minimum, you could give them their just rewards.
Yep. Steve, you wanted to say something here?
Yeah, well, I think that I just want to say a little bit more about Jeff Bezos's role here. I think it's kind of the elephant in the room. Amazon as a company is pretty notorious for not allowing its workers to unionize. It was covered really well, I think, in the recent PBS documentary on Frontlines called, I believe, Amazon Empire. But basically, the company says that it treats its workers so well that it doesn't need a union. So that's why they haven't allowed a union. They go above and beyond on compensation and benefits and all of that. And clearly that's not the case, as we're seeing in the Whole Food situation. Clearly it's not the case as we've seen for its frontline workers, even before this whole coronavirus pandemic situation started. There's been all kinds of horror stories about what it's like to work in a warehouse at Amazon, or what it's like to be a delivery person for Amazon. And Bezos's response so far that I've seen has been, he's created the Amazon Relief Fund, which is a $25 million pot of money that people who are delivering stuff to people's homes can maybe tap into if they have medical bills and stuff. But considering how many people, Amazon is being plugged into as basically like this mainline resource for the whole country right now. So they have essentially a monopoly over getting stuff to people's homes, not a de facto one. There's other companies, but they're huge right now. $25 million won't go very far for a workforce that big. And a lot of people basically called that thing a PR maneuver by Bezos to make it seem like he kind of cared about his workers more than he did. And I want to just say one more thing about Amazon, because I did a quick kind of a ding at Obama before. Amazon's spokesperson, I think it's just pretty illuminating looking back at the Obama era. Their spokesperson is Jay Carney, who is the former person who used to get in front of the podium and answer questions at the White House press briefings. He was the communications director for the White House for a while. So now he's working for Amazon. It's a depiction of the revolving door between Washington and the private sector and huge companies like Amazon.
This no longer qualifies as news, of course. Anyway, thank you, Steve. And actually, I think we're going to keep you on for a bit. We're going to go now to a story that we had on the Real News about how the sports world is being affected by the virus pandemic. We were lucky enough to have Zirin, forgetting his first name, interviewed by Mark Steiner, talking about these changes in the sports world as we speak. And of course, the class struggle does go on the ballpark and the court. Dwayne, start us off on the video.
Since I've written that article that got a lot of publicity this week was with the Philadelphia 76ers, where their all-star center Joel Embiid said he was going to give $500,000 to pay the workers. And that so humiliated the ownership and embarrassed them that they put out a statement just yesterday that they would pay their workers during the duration of this crisis. And that was something that they were not going to do until Embiid stepped up and put his money down. And I do think that there is this strong connection, because I know we view this often as, these are millionaire athletes and, they play a game and all the tropes that are used against athletes and class consciousness. You have to remember the backgrounds that many of these athletes come from are extremely working class and at times very impoverished backgrounds. So there is this strong connection that these athletes have with the workers at the stadiums, this strong connection of what it means to struggle to survive. And that's something that the ownership class just will never understand.
I think that's right.
When you table,
you can end that, Dwayne. Steve, I think that's a really good point, and it reminds me of something I saw earlier and that we don't have loaded up, which is I think it was a basketball player in the Miami Heat talking about growing up in Liberty City, which is one of the poor neighborhoods down there, and really embodying this intense connection between growing up in a poor, impoverished part of town while simultaneously being a famous athlete who enjoys, a big salary and a lot of fame. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, you're talking about, there's a great article by Udonis Haslem, who's a veteran NBA player. And just to talk about his article for a second, that was really, he was calling out these privileged kids who are coming to Miami for spring break, going to Miami Beach, loading up the beaches, putting people in his community at huge risk who never get to spend time at a place like Miami Beach and don't get to enjoy the beach in the same way as these privileged, probably mostly white kids, affluent white kids get to appreciate. And he basically was calling them out and saying, to just be blunt, he was saying, go the fuck home. You're putting a lot of people at risk and you don't even realize if your short-sightedness. So I think that was a really strong article coming from someone of his stature and of his background of growing up in that area of Miami that you mentioned, Charles. And to Dave Zirin's point, one of the really the huge developments last week as well, and I think we covered on the Real News also, was the shuttering of the Olympic Games for 2020 in Tokyo and moving it 1 year later to 2021. And in of itself, I'm not sure that, because there's so much the limelight on the Olympics and the glory of the Olympics and all that, I don't think that most people watching probably realize that a massive bulk of the people who compete in the Olympics are actually in poverty, because most of the sports that they play and compete in don't pay very much money. So, for example, long distance running, it pays like almost no money unless you're like the top the very, like maybe like Usain Bolt or someone of that level, or Mo Farah in the UK. But it's like a very small percentage of people who can make a decent income doing it. And I mean, that's sort of the tragedy of this whole thing, is like, how are these people going to make money now? And I actually have a friend locally in San Diego who trains. She's she made the U.S. team at speed walking. And basically I talked to her last week. She told me that she had to declare for unemployment and really like has no idea how she's going to make money this year. And yeah, she's been fighting very hard in the United States track and field, the organization USATF, to push for unionizing and making sure that people who compete in track and field events can actually make a livable income. But yeah, there's huge class disparity within sports as well, not just between the ownership class and the athletes in those major sports, but between the major sports and people who compete in sort of the smaller sports that are kind of only maybe popular every 4 years during the Olympic Games.
Yeah, if I could chime in here, even though donating money to the staff of the organizations, all that stuff is great and is necessary, and it's a shame on the owners that they didn't step up to do it in the first place. But trying to kind of like step back and look at the broader picture of this whole situation, you have a situation though where some of these NBA players, athletes in general, are being tested or were being tested, especially at the onset, when everybody started to really sort of grasp, the situation, that it was much more dire than we were estimating. You have them being tested before, before tests were readily available to the public, which I don't even know if they are even now, but it just shows this sort of emphasis on this culture about this glorification of celebrity, of fame, of entertainment over ordinary people. They're in a genuine sense, whatever test or whatever means that we had of testing the public should have been put towards that, testing the public, versus simply just testing a bunch of people who let's all be frank, have the ability to overcome something like this, and have the ability to self-quarantine without any sort of worries or anything like that. So it just it highlights where our politicians put their allegiance, where our
wait, hold on, Tunde, urgent call from the president. He's concerned about the most vulnerable possible victims. Alert the NBA.
Yeah.
Well, can I jump in real quick here? Because to your point, Tunde, I agree. I mean, the class discrepancy between who is afforded the right to have a COVID-19 test and who is not is pretty stark. At the same time, as we're talking about the NBA, as we're talking about the NCAA March Madness tournament that would probably be going on right now, we're talking about the NHL, we're talking about Major League Baseball. I mean, these are teams and organizations that range from about 30 to 50 people per team, plus staff, plus coaches. So something like COVID-19, like Rudy Gobert's goofy ass, caught the virus for the Utah Jazz. Another Jazz player tested positive. Probably other players did too. And these guys are flying all around the country. So I was kind of okay with testing the athletes because of how many people that they come in contact with and how many different cities that they are in a given week. I mean, they would have been seeding the entire country, probably. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not too mad at testing the athletes.
I can agree with that. The problem that I think I have with it though is that, okay, if we're talking about shutting down the NBA for a specific, or I guess unspecific amount of time, or doing these type of things, okay, you have the ability to do that. You have Rudy, as you pointed out, Rudy Gobert's goofy ass, testing positive for the coronavirus. Okay, but you don't need to test the entire NBA if the decision at that point is to, hey, okay, let's shut things down for a while. Let's reevaluate, see where we are. All those people have the ability to go home, to get themselves taken care of. They have excellent, health coverage. So just I guess the beef that I have is that it sort of it puts forth this sort of idea, like, so, you know, if we're talking about like so for instance, like the wildfires, and maybe Steve, you can chime in since this is, you know, this kind of your territory since you're over there on the West Coast. But if you have like the wildfires, and you know, you have this sort of selective process on what fires get put out, when they get put out, like it's like, you know, it's like ordinary people just don't matter at the end of the day. And I understand that NBA players, they go all across the world, they do a lot of things, but if you decide to just shut things down and say, okay, you know, see that this is a serious issue, let's go ahead and shut this down. They have the ability to go to their sort of isolated spaces and be okay. It's the people who go, like, I remember hearing about, I've heard, you know, cases of people who are pregnant who walk into to a hospital who are unable to get a test for the coronavirus. And when I hear cases like that, I start to question this sort of this belief, or this culture that celebrities get tested, or athletes get tested, but ordinary people who walk into a hospital can't get tested to figure out if this is exactly what's going on with them, if they have some sort of symptoms. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I'm glad you brought that up, Tunde. There's like another iteration of that, because just talk about the wildfires, but also talk about what you're talking about. The parallel would be during the wildfires, like a couple of years ago when they got really bad. And then in the aftermath, there was actually very bad mudslides in Santa Barbara, which is where a lot of wealthy people in Hollywood live. Oprah lives there, for example. And I believe that, like, their stories were like held up as this big tragedy, and like, you know, there was such a big deal. No, it's a big deal, obviously, but then, like, what does it mean on the contrary? What does it mean that other people's stories don't necessarily get killed? I think it just shows, like, as you said, I think it depicts a bigger problem with celebrity culture in the United States.
Thank you, Steve. And we're gonna end this segment talking about sports and the coronavirus, and we're moving on to talking about, this is a perfect name, the Hoover Institute, a conservative think tank. Turns out one of their scholars, one of their people, their fellows, is on the hook for some of the crazy ass science behind President Trump and his circles when they were doing things early on about how we didn't have to act so much and it won't be as bad as it is in Italy or China, or talking about how quickly we can resume normal activities. They're just being batshit crazy. So I want to find out, you know, what's going on here? Where is this coming from? Steve, can you enlighten us?
Yeah, so this original theory came, well, not the original theory, but the theory that the Trump administration was running with, according to reporting by the Washington Post, came from one of their fellows at the Hoover Institution, which is based out of Stanford. He's actually a law professor at NYU, so this kind of has impact on both coasts of the United States, I guess. But yeah, so he's this guy named Richard Epstein. He is well known even within the circles of the law and economics field, which is kind of a free market Chicago school of economics within law that basically puts neoliberalism as the principle that around which all law should be based. His number was, this will only get to about 500 people dying, therefore we should not overreact, and business as usual should continue. And that argument actually got a lot of clout within the Trump administration, despite the fact that he has no background in science at all. His legal scholarship has nothing to do with medicine or medicinal science or anything like that. He's totally in this Chicago school of law and economics, as I said. And I think that just shows, I think it almost shows one of the root causes of why the Trump administration response has been so messed up compared to the rest of the world. Just a couple notes about the Hoover Institution. So historically, they have received funding, and people listening probably won't be surprised, funding from the Koch brothers, for example, ExxonMobil, for example, and lots of the right-wing constellation of foundations. And even outside of this, the Hoover Institution has been very influential on debates over foreign policy. They're known as a neoliberal shop, and where lots of neoliberal arguments get started have this veneer of scholarly legitimacy, but just basically push for American imperialism around the world. So wasn't surprised to see that this guy was housed within the Hoover Institution, but it does show like the long track record of destruction that this particular shop has had in U.S. discourse.
That's right. And Kim, we were interested in how else the sort of right-wing anti-science perspective is percolating in the culture. Why don't you update us on what's been happening at Liberty University?
Yes, Liberty University, that bastion of intelligentsia. It is just bubbling with science and more science, and they love science. No, that's a lie. So Liberty University is the college in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is run by Jerry Falwell Jr. It was founded by his father. It's a very conservative. I hate to be mean to these people, but they it's a backwards little place. I don't even understand what kind of accreditation Liberty University must have, but I digress. So as colleges and universities around the country are shutting down or have shut down because of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, here in Maryland, the University of Maryland went on spring break and then told the kids, don't even come back from spring break. Y'all just stay wherever y'all are. They haven't even let the kids move out of their dorms at the University of Maryland College Park. So that's just to give you an idea of how some colleges are taking the pandemic seriously, but not Liberty University. Because after their spring break was over, Jerry Falwell Jr. refused to close the campus. So the spring semester began and students began coming back to the campus. Problem was, at least one student has tested positive for COVID-19, with roughly a dozen others showing symptoms. Now, the university physician, some goofy, I can't remember his name. Anyway, so when Jerry Falwell Jr. was seeking his advice about whether or not to let students come back to campus, he was basically saying, it's up to you, which is an odd position for a physician to take when we're talking about a disease that has no cure and no vaccine at the moment. So right now.
But Kim, you mean odd for a physician in an institution that is not loyal to Jesus? Because that would affect things, would it not?
There's a lot of Jesus believers who also believe in social distancing, who also believe in antibiotics, who also believe in vaccines. I can't put that all on the Jesus crowd, because I think evangelical white Southern Christians are a very unique brood, and their disdain for things that are perceived to be liberal, like learning, education, science, evolution, data. These things offend them for reasons that I'm not quite sure. But so what's happening at Liberty, about half the students who live on campus have already gone home. As far as I can tell, classes are still ongoing. But the people in Lynchburg, because Lynchburg is a place, my God, if I lived in Lynchburg, Virginia, I don't know how I feel about the name in itself. I'd have to move to the next town over to I have to move to Blacksburg, where Virginia Tech.
Subtle, very, very subtle down there.
Right. But okay, so the people of Lynchburg are all pissed off. And let me get the mayor's name, because she has a wonderful name. Her name is, and she's a Black woman as well. Her name is Bonnie Sverick, the mayor and city manager here. Yeah, she's relieved that 2 weeks ago when Mr. Falwell assured them that he fully intended to comply with Virginia's public health directives. Now, this is interesting because as of today, the governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam, issued a stay-at-home order, a shelter-in-place order for the state of Virginia, Dwayne, I know you know what's up with that. I can't recall if it's in effect right now or if it's supposed to start later this evening, because here in Maryland, Governor Hogan also issued a stay-at-home directive, which begins at 8 o'clock tonight. So Liberty University, them kids might be shit out of luck. Like, y'all might have to go home now because the state is on lockdown, and it seems that Governor Northam, to his credit, is looking out for the best interests, not only of Liberty University students and staff, but the town of Lynchburg as well, where, again, people reside there without being associated with the university, and they don't want all these kids coming back from spring break, possibly, spreading the COVID-19 virus throughout the town, and I don't blame them.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I expect that before the pandemic is over, we're going to see a lot of instances where faith and science come into battle and where science invariably wins. Moving on to the next big story here, and this one is close to my heart. A big argument has broken out across the political press and, of course, on Twitter about AOC's statements regarding what left strategy should look like in the next phase. This is prompted by a Politico article that is looking at the endorsement strategy of Bernie versus Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And while there's a lot of similarities, it turns out there's a little bit of daylight between how they've behaved in terms of endorsements. Tunde, can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, there's a Politico article that illustrates AOC's sort of more strategic or more sort of pragmatic approach to how she maneuvers versus Bernie Sanders, and basically talks about who she selects to endorse for in terms of primarying existing Democratic incumbents. This article kind of it talks about a lot of different things, but some of the things that it sort of like that it sort of alerted my ears sort of stood up as soon as I started seeing these things, where there were comments from political commentators or people who are heavily involved in the current Democratic establishment. It had some sort of glowing endorsements from them. So these include James Carville, Neer Tanden. They were saying kind of glowing things about AOC, which should immediately alert AOC that something might be wrong in this exact scenario. But yeah, there were some, they said, so for instance, Neer Tanden says, there are some people on the left who thought that their views represented a strong majority, and the primary process has shown that voters diverged, that Sanders is winning a majority and a smaller minority than he had 4 years ago. So when I hear things like that, I start to worry about AOC sort of falling for this whole parade of, okay, let's reach over to the other side and decide the progressive wing versus the sort of corporate wing of the Democratic Party. And let's build coalitions and let's make this, let's make this work. This is how we can affect change, is by taking this sort of incremental approach. But the problem I think that stands with that, and it won't be a mystery to where I kind of stand on the spectrum, is we've tried that time after time, election after election. We've tried this whole sort of let's build coalitions, let's work with the other side, and it gets you at the end of the day squat. It's like whack-a-mole. You argue for this position and you concede on others, and then those other things become issues, and now you're dealing with other problems that you didn't foresee. The thing you need to do is just rebuild the entire thing, rebuild the entire process. So from Neer Tanden's quote, what I would like to sort of point to is that she's saying that, okay, not everybody agrees with Sanders. In fact, his is a minority, but that's not true. So take, for instance, a place like Mississippi, when they did exit polls, the New York Times had exit polls from the primary that just occurred there. They asked the question, how do you feel about replacing all private health insurance with a single government plan for everyone? They indicated that 60% support Medicare, or I guess a single government plan versus a private health insurance plan versus 30%. And in the last in a KFF poll from back in January indicated that about 50% of Democrats favored favored Medicare for all versus 68% who would favor a public option. All these things indicate that you actually have the actual voters on your side with the actual issues. What the problem is,
Hold on. Tunde, what it's showing is not that the voters are on the side of a candidate like Bernie Sanders because they agree with him on the issues. What it's showing is that even though they agree with him on the issues, they still don't like him.
Right.
And what they're suggesting is one of the reasons for that might be that he didn't reach out to the local dignitaries in the establishment, people who may also have become pro single payer Medicare for all, by not reaching out to this layer of respected Democrats, elected officials, what have you at the local level. They're signaling to the base of people in those communities that Bernie Sanders is not interested in kissing the right rings. And if that's what they want to get Medicare for all, maybe Bernie should kiss a few more.
No, absolutely not. So the problem with that ideology is that they'll ever concede what Bernie wants when it falls directly opposed to essentially what they want, which is, money. At the end of the day, I didn't know that much about the political process about 4 years ago, and I still claim that I probably still don't know all that much, but I know enough to know that money essentially runs everything. Right. And so if you're lying to yourself, if you believe that, just, having people over for dinner, or, remembering that, hey, is it Jim's birthday today? Is it your son's birthday today? Oh, hey, happy birthday to Jim, and then powwowing with everybody is suddenly going to make them go for certain measures that you're for, or flip from, being for, I think, being for things like instead of only going as far as like a public option, going even further with a Medicare for all a plan, it's not. And we're lying to ourselves if we think that's going to be the case. The reason why they're voting in the way that they do isn't because of any sort of ideological belief. It's because they know who sort of greases the wheels in Washington, and I believe that it's being made otherwise.
You just conflated voting for legislation with voting in a primary. So while I would mostly agree with you that the way our legislation moves through the process is heavily influenced by money, especially corporate and wealthy donor money, I don't think that's true for how people vote in primary elections. And the best example would be is that Bernie Sanders had the largest war chest of any candidate by a lot. And he was willing to spend enormous amounts of it in states like South Carolina, and it didn't do squat for him. So if he has the money to, quote unquote, get the votes that he needs at the primary level, we're still missing an explanation for why large numbers of people, including working class and black voters, said no to him, but yes to his issue.
Right. I think I might have an answer for you. It's pretty simple. It's called the mainstream media, right? I think it was well over, I think 50%, and I might be getting this stat slightly wrong, but I think it was something over 50% of the people said, or by and large said that they make the decision for who to vote for in the last 24, 48 hours of voting. So what that means is that they're turning on cable television and seeing, everybody's saying that Biden's the guy, boom. That's the guy. Okay, let's vote for that guy. He's the one who can beat Trump. This whole idea of Biden being the more electable of the two, it's nothing but this sort of mainstream media sort of concoction of we have nothing else to say about Joe, so let's just say he's electable, and to convince people that he's the only one who can beat Trump, when anybody who can objectively sort of look at the situation as is, look at all the facts of the situation, it's preposterous to think that. So if the mainstream media didn't work in tandem with the establishment, then we wouldn't be seeing I firmly believe that we wouldn't be seeing the results that we're seeing.
But in a state like South Carolina, a lot of folks talked about the influence of Senator James Clyburn, whose last-minute endorsement of Biden seemed to really sway a lot of people. But when Senator Clyburn made that endorsement, there's one thing you can count on.
I'm sorry, Charles. He's in the House of Representatives, Clyburn.
Representative Clyburn. Thank you for that correction, Kim. When he made that endorsement, he knew that he wasn't going to piss off a large body of elected officials or Democratic Party insiders in that state who cared about the success of Bernie Sanders. And the reason why that layer didn't exist has a lot to do with the strategy of the campaign. Instead of cultivating those relationships, attending the right events, shaking the right hands, basically observing the formal, diplomatic, polite rituals of politicking with the right people, because he didn't do that, it made it all the more easy for the mainstream media and folks like Representative Clyburn to do what they did and basically change the outcome of the election, very dramatically at the last minute. I'm not saying that Bernie had a chance of getting the entire mainstream media on his side or even getting Representative Clyburn, but there's a lot of gray area. Even something as simple as getting Clyburn to have endorsed a week earlier would have made a difference. A week earlier would have been time to respond.
But Charles, are you saying that that there was ever a chance that Clyburn was ever going to endorse?
No. I'm not. I'm saying there's a gray area, because you can get someone who's definitely going to endorse your opponent and say, okay, but can you do it earlier instead of 24 hours before? Or can you do it at an event in which other people support other candidates? I guess I'm not revealing much to anyone by saying there's a lot of nuance in exactly how things happen, when they happen, the right forums. And I'm saying that Bernie sabotaged his own campaign by not doing enough of the traditional Democrat stuff in states where the traditional Democrats hold as much power as they do, like South Carolina.
Right, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you about that. That you have to be strategic in terms of what you do and how you do it. And I'm not even, this whole article from Politico was about AOC and how she might be sliding towards that ever so present sort of obviously not centrist or anything like that, but she's kind of leaning towards, oh, hey, let me work with the establishment. Let me see if we can broker some deals here. I'm not even saying that that's a bad approach, but it can only go so far before you have to admit to yourself that they don't actually have an interest in actually helping you or carry out any of your interests, because it lies in opposition to what they believe and what they know to be true for themselves. You're essentially feeding the system if you do that. So I'm not even saying she's wrong necessarily, so much as let's watch with a close eye of how far she takes it, because that's a very, very slippery slope.
Can I say something real quick here? Because, I read that article too, and my takeaway was, Neera Tanden has something nice to say about AOC. What in the hell is AOC? She must have said something completely wrong. And I was reading some of the comments on Twitter. An endorsement from Neera is akin to the kiss of death, right? Because like the Center for American Progress might as well be called the Center for the Democratic Establishment, because a lot of their stuff is not progressive, at least in the vein of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders type of progressive. So yeah, AOC, she's in the House. Obviously, she has to behave like a legislator. Legislators have to make compromises. We've seen Bernie Sanders, even as a senator and during his time in the House of Representatives as well. Bernie had to compromise on a lot of stuff. And to his credit, on things like the crime bill of 94, at the time, he got on the floor of Congress and made his opposition to the bill known. He said, this is why I don't like this. It's going to have these negative effects. It's going to be harmful to these communities. I'm voting for this bill because the Violence Against Women's Act is included in it, and it's something that's very important to me. So basically, he held his nose and cast an affirmative vote. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is, of course, going to have to do some things like that as well. But this is, I think, manipulation on behalf of the Democratic establishment to maybe let some actors like Neera Tanden and James Carville, offer some praise to Alexandria AOC, and people like her base and Bernie's base kind of look at them, look at her sideways like, what? Why are you saying things that these goofballs agree with, right?
Yeah, it's this sort of, I think everybody, who's in these circles, they've all read The Art of War. They all have like a very specific playbook that they go for. But I think the main issue here is when you start to see somebody believe that they somehow like have their best interest at heart. So take, for instance, AOC has kind of gone through some staff changes recently. And Lauren Hitt, who we actually mentioned in a previous story that we talked about, she essentially worked, I think, previously with Hickenlooper as well as O'Rourke in the primary election. And we saw how their candidacies turned out once they sort of took that sort of more moderate, more centrist, more sort of diplomatic route, right? We saw where that led all of their candidacies, as well as Elizabeth Warren, right? As soon as she started kind of taking that more sort of centrist lane and saying, oh, I'm all for Medicare for all, but also let's just do a public option first, and then we'll see where we're at for Medicare for all. You see where that leads you. And I think, Kim, it's brilliant in that I think it's about co-op, right? Let's how do we co-opt this movement? How do we sow dissension from within in order divide and conquer? That's exactly what the name of the game is. Anytime you want to kind of step on a movement or step on a cause, you divide and conquer. You split it up, and then you conquer the individual pieces. It's a playbook that's well known, and I hope it doesn't work in this case, because I think AOC has proved to be, in historically speaking, a firebrand for the left, and it's something that we desperately need, especially if Bernie does not win this primary election. She, like the article points out, is essentially the next in line to step forward for the movement.
Steve, did you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this just speaks to my broader journalistic ethos speaking here, rather than even. I'll say one thing about the political piece, which was interesting, is that they couldn't get AOC on the record. So a lot of this stuff is them weaving their own narrative around. I'm not sticking up for AOC by any means, because I'll cover that in my next point. But without her talking, it's sort of like getting other people to sort of situate what she's doing with it. She just didn't comment for the article. They tried to reach out and she wouldn't. So a lot of this is sort of other people analyzing the situation rather than it coming from her own voice. I'd be super curious to hear what she's doing, what she thinks she's doing. I'm not sure when or if we'll get that explanation, but I think that'd be the key one that's missing here. And then the other thing, it just goes to my point. I think that some people on the left were saying all along with the AOC phenomenon when she got elected, and sort of like saying, is this like a huge shift? Could Congress move way left? What's the situation? And I think one of the most convincing analyses that I saw was, what I think, first of all, is that we shouldn't put too much faith in people in Congress like doing the right thing. It's still going to take social movements, and I think that we shouldn't be idolizing anyone too much. And that kind of gets to the other point that I wanted to make, which is back then people were essentially saying that same thing, and also just sort of asking, like, is sort of AOC, is it sort of more of like an employment opportunity as opposed to a movement? I don't want to say that it's one or the other, but I think that it is kind of disheartening that these firings happen, and she is sort of being entrenched in the Washington machine. I think that's the reality. I think that's sort of like, if you want to look at the parable, is the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I think it happens to everyone that gets entrenched in the Washington system, including someone that's someone like AOC. Sorry to be so blunt about it, but.
Thank you very much, Steve Horn. And now, as we do towards the end of each episode, we're going to move to talk about some of the more interesting things that we have today. And first up is a unusual video from a politician down in Kentucky. And let's go, Dwayne.
Brown says in an initial post he was being accused on Facebook of fear-mongering after he wrote about a confirmed case in northern Kentucky. So then Brown made another post using what some would call colorful language on a neighborhood group that has since gone viral.
You know, I guess I kind of popped my lid there a little bit, lost my cool. It's probably not a good look for myself, and you know, probably not the look that my residents would like to see from their mayor. So for that, I'm a little sorry, but you know, sometimes, you know, you reach a breaking point.
Ultimately, Brown says he wants people to take the coronavirus seriously and wouldn't mind getting his sports back.
You know, I'm going to try to take a more proactive approach here, but I'm going to let the governor handle the updates from here on out. He does a better job at it, I think. So.
Tunde, what was great about that video? Tunde, let's start over again. Tell us what was great about the video.
Sorry. Yeah, I guess I was muted there. I was just so excited to talk about this that I probably hit my mute button. But I don't even know where to start with this. This is my new favorite guy, and I don't know anything about him, so maybe I shouldn't say he's my new favorite guy until I read up a little bit about him. But he puts out this post, as the video just pointed out, that was just the best. So he starts it out by saying, "Listen up, dipshits and sensible people." I don't know why the sensible people's thrown in there. You've kind of already offended everybody. And then he goes on to talk about how he tries to deliver facts about the coronavirus, and that people were essentially saying that he's fear mongering by doing so. But then he goes on and says, "I'm tired of COVID-19 conference calls. I take 3 a day, plus one more extra on the weekend with Kenton County," and he's in Kentucky, as you heard in the video. "If you don't like what I'm telling you, then go buy some toilet paper." I'm not sure exactly what he means there. I guess he's saying to basically F off, I guess, is what he's saying. And then he goes on to even say further, "I pray every night that the state, county, and region that I love with all my heart will stop doing nonsensical things. Treat this seriously. If you don't, then screw you." And then he puts in quotation marks, "Fuck you is what I meant, is what I want to say, but can't." Even though he
just said it.
Just said it. And so possibly the best part about this is he ends it by saying, "Be responsible. If you don't, then screw you. Warmest regards, Mayor Gabe Brown." Oh man, it's just simply hilarious. I don't even know if that needs any more context than that. But he's basically, look, and most likely he's probably going to get let go, or he's going to get voted out, or something's going to happen of this that's of consequence. But he's my new favorite guy, because that's really how blunt and how blank you have to be with people in order to get them to listen, and to take you seriously, especially if there aren't many cases of the virus in your area. Then it's all the more you should be doing to not let it become a thing in your area. And so he's doing the Lord's work by putting out inflammatory comments like this.
And I like this trend in politicians who are authentic and where you really feel that they're saying what they mean, and coincidentally they're not terribly racist. So that's always a good thing. And now we're going to go on to our next video. First time ever in the history of this show, a TikTok for you. And this TikTok, it works a little bit better when there's a little bit of context. But basically, you have this lovely young woman who's getting ready to do a good deed in the neighborhood. And, if you don't know someone's phone number, you just make a sign, to let your neighbors know that you care about them and you want to be helpful. But, this is a very diverse country, and we have a lot of people want to help, but not everyone wants to be helped. And I thought, we ought to give just a little tip of the hat to the segment of the population that not only doesn't want to be helped, they kind of resent the fact that you asked them in the first place. So let that be a lesson to all of you virtue signalers. Stop asking people in public and on TikToks about how you can help and be useful. We don't need any more of that. Excuse me. And now on to the next. There's a wonderful tweet we have from Las Vegas about how Nevada is going to handle homeless people needing to be socially distanced while homeless. And here you can see that they basically installed lines on a weird kind of parking lot sort of thing, so everyone can have their own spot with lines around it. Most of the comments were pretty ferociously condemning this practice, but I wonder if one of you guys has something to say about this.
Well, I know that at the height of the home foreclosure crisis, Las Vegas had the most amount of empty houses by far, even by the standards of larger metropolitan areas. I'm sure there's a lot of empty houses and empty apartments and empty all kinds of stuff in Las Vegas.
Oh, hold on. If there wasn't a single empty house, think of the hotels. They're empty.
Well,
That's what I was
mean,
going to say.
Why not house these people in places like that anyway? I mean, this is just another example of how really we as a society devalue our fellow man and woman and child every single day. I mean, you walk around Baltimore City, there is so many people who are unhoused and dealing with a lot of other issues such as mental illness or substance abuse as well. And for the city of Las Vegas to even take the time to paint like rectangles for people, fuck you. Like that is a slap in the face to all of humanity, and it is not the right way to deal with the homeless social distancing issue, period. I don't care where it is, in Vegas or wherever. That's a dumb idea. Boo for Vegas. That was not good.
Yeah, and just to Charles' point for a second here on Vegas, for example, where there's lots of hotels. California, the hotels are being opened up to homeless people, including here in San Diego, but not only here. And it's been a directive from Governor Newsom. So it's definitely a possibility. And it just shows how wrong what's happening in Nevada is based on the fact that you can't go to a hotel right now anyway, and they're going to be open for months due to this public health crisis that we have. So yeah, it's just a pretty disgusting situation in Nevada.
Yeah, there's also a commentary about Las Vegas. If you're going to have a city that prides itself as the destination for hedonistic fun and sin, you are going to have a problem during a pandemic. And now we're going on to our next one. This comes to us from just outside Pittsburgh. And it might be hard for you to see, especially if you're on your phone, but that is, you're looking at a highway with a line of cars that are barely moving. This is the line of local residents waiting to pick up food from the Duquesne Food Bank. And as you see this sort of video, you see just how many there are. There's hundreds of cars in line. And it was terrible to see how many of the comments were essentially denouncing the folks waiting in line. Oh, how come you have money for car insurance and gasoline? As if owning a car and putting gas in it wasn't a requirement for many people just to go about their daily lives. And it's a sign that however bad things are now, not only are they going to get worse, but people have finally figured out that they're going to get much worse. And if that means grabbing some free food from the pantry, so be it. And now for the last funny story here. I've saved it for last. This is from the Israeli, Israel has the same kind of weird testing services where you drive through and you either pick up or drop off your testing. There's a wait that's involved. So if we can run that video off of Twitter, Dwayne, and you'll see how the EMTs, the emergency technicians, emergency medical techs are entertaining the people waiting in line for either the results of their test or to swab their nose or however it's being done. You got that for us? Is there sound?
I mean, we could make up our own sound.
Well,
yeah, let's...
the original one The original one featured them dancing to basically club music, and the people in the car are shrieking in delight. And what I was impressed by is that this is not simply some technicians dancing for people who may or may not have coronavirus. These people are coordinated. They have a routine. There's more than two of them at certain times. I thought that was a great moment of levity in an otherwise dark time. So thank you for that.
Should we play like some, do we play judge here? Do we like what score do we give them? What's the
give them a score?
What's
Yeah.
the ranking? Yeah, I'm gonna go about a 7.5. I feel like they could have leaned into the like what do you call that? Like the that's not the wave. That's what is that? Can anybody name that move? What move is that?
The one with the hands. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, what is it? Like, yeah.
In the comments, people. In the comments.
Somebody help us out.
I don't know what song they're dancing to because I don't know if they're on beat. I don't know if these moves coordinate right with whatever said song. I mean, there's
I feel
a
like
lot
it's something
of
from the
underlying
90s.
information here.
It's got to be something from the 90s. That's the only time it's appropriate to pull out moves like this.
Yeah.
I mean, this looks like this. They look like the junior varsity, cheerleading squad. Like,
wait. I knew you were going to say that, Kim. I knew, Kim, you'd say that. Here's the thing to remember: Israel has no tradition of cheerleading, so yeah, they would do that as well.
It's on brand.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway. Super pleased to have all of you in for this lovely hour plus that we've spent together. This is Stir Crazy on the Real News Network. We are in the middle of our spring fundraising season, and we are entirely dependent on our satisfied viewers around the world to continue to stay on the air. We would love to hear your opinions of this show, any feedback, what we can do better, what topics we're ignoring. Let us see your lighter-hearted tweets or pictures or videos that we can showcase in our next show. We are very likely to do this again tomorrow, but in any case, please do come by. We're at therealnews.com. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube. We're on Instagram. We would love to see you and get to know you better. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Hello, I'm Gerald Dent.
And I'm Mark Steiner.
We here at the Real News.
And we're here to talk to you about the future of the Real News.
We are in dire need of $50,000.
And you can make that happen for all of us and for yourselves.
So go to donate.
And make a pledge now to the Real News and let us keep growing the news you love to watch.
Pretty please.
Thank you.